Welcome back, America. First live broadcast of 2023 would not be complete without checking in with our own four-star, very favorite Admiral, Admiral James Stavridis, retired United States Navy, former Allied Supreme Commander of NATO, former head of Southern Command. Good morning, Admiral. Happy New Year to you.
Doing great, Hugh. I've got one more day. I'm squeezing out a vacation, but tomorrow I fly up to New York and head into the office like so many folks.
Are you still in Florida then?
I am. The absolute highlight, by the way, of my holiday was playing a game of Battleship with my 7-year-old granddaughter, wait for it, who beat me like a drum. So
I saw the tweet on that, and I'm all with her. If you can take down the Admiral early. Now, I played Stavridis bingo before I read your column, because you have a new column from Bloomberg. It's a must-read. Expect the unexpected in 2023. Before I read it, I did Stavridis bingo, and I had tactical nuclear weapon on my bingo card, but I did not have letter of marque, and I doubt anybody else did, nor did I have deep espionage. So let's start with the probability of the tactical nuke, then let's explain why letter of marque is in your Bloomberg column as well as deep espionage. What do you put the percentage of the use of a tactical nuke by Putin in a desperate position right now?
Hey, if we're allowed to have good news, here is some good news. I think it's very, very low, well under 5%. It just doesn't buy him anything. And tactically, it won't shatter the Ukrainians. They'll be prepared to deal with it. He's not going to go strategic nuke because he knows that'll invite a massive response against Russia. And at the end of the day, here's the biggest reason he won't use a nuke, Hugh. He knows if he does, the opprobrium, the anger, the complete rejection of his doing so will go way beyond the West. It'll be India, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, all those swing vote countries. I would include President Xi's China in that group. They will walk away from Putin. He knows that. So I think the chances of him actually using a nuclear weapon are low. He'll continue to threaten it. We need to consider it. We need to take him seriously. But if you really look at the probabilities, almost de minimis.
Now, Admiral, you know the phrase Chicago rules from the great movie The Untouchables. The Moscow rules comes from Danny Silva and from the intelligence world. There's also Soviet rules, which may be back, which is the bullet in the back of the head. What is the likelihood, after that strike in Ukraine yesterday that killed dozens, if not hundreds, of Russian conscripts using their cell phones in what is an astonishing breach of even rudimentary security operation, what is the chance that somebody takes action on their own in Russia?
I still think it's very, very low. Frankly, what happened yesterday, as you correctly point out, here are all these Russian conscripts. They don't even have rifles. All they have are their cell phones. So they're calling home, typically to their girlfriend, to their mother, describing how terrible everything is. We have many, many transcripts of this that are being intercepted. The critical mass of those phone calls allowed the Ukrainians to pinpoint a location where they could clearly see not only were there masses of the Russian troops, but they had a pre-existing knowledge that this was also an ammunition depot for the Russians. So, boy, that becomes a very juicy target. Cue up the ATACMS, 4 of them by media reports strike. If there were 60 Russians killed, which is what Moscow's reporting, I would be shocked. It's more like 600. Don't forget, this is the Russian machine that told you the cruiser Slava, which sank with 500 sailors on it early in this war, went down because of bad smoking around the fuel tanks and so on. So figure hundreds of Russians killed, and yet, Hugh, it's just not going to have an impact, at least at this moment, on the Russian psyche. If anything, it'll anger them. Putin will use it to whip up spirit against the Ukrainians. Fortunately, he has very few military cards to play, additional ones at this point. Look for him to continue the bombing, wave the nuclear card around, although he won't use it, and in his mind, try and get those conscripts into some kind of fighting shape for a spring offensive. He doesn't have many cards to play at this point.
Let's also talk now about the letter of marque. What your column is devoted to is cyber capability is growing as the number of devices that the world becomes wired to, including your Nest that you can open your Florida garage from 10,000 miles away. So we're all netted up. But that means there are a lot of targets for the pirates of the world, and I'm thinking specifically of the Russian cyber pirates and the more disciplined Chinese cyber pilots. How great a risk is this, and has American industrial capacity figured this in yet?
I think it is very high on the list of concerns for 2023. And let's go back to Putin for a moment. As we just agreed, he has very few conventional military cards left to play. So what does he have? He still has very significant cyber capacity. And here we come to the idea of a letter of marque. Got to do 3 seconds of history here. Go back to Queen Elizabeth, the years about 1600 or so. The Spanish are moving their gold, their silver in particular, out of the Americas back to Spain. She goes to her pirates, literally civilian mariners, and says, I will give you a letter of marque. It means you have the Queen's mark, the Queen's permission to conduct piracy at sea. Anything you capture out there will be yours. I may take a small percentage of the silver that you capture, but basically you're now a pirate, but you're also an official actor of England. Flash forward to today, this is what Putin is saying to the cyber gangs of Russia, who are very good. These are the ones who are launching ransomware attacks constantly. They threaten all sectors of U.S. Western society. Putin is saying, I'll give you a letter of marque, the dictator's letter of marque. You can go after these Western targets. You can gain the ransomwares, do whatever you want. I'll protect you. That's really what's happening here. So look for, as the year unfolds, an increase in the kind of cyber activity directed against, frankly, weaker segments of the U.S. Infrastructure. Finance, pretty well protected. Military, pretty well protected. Consumer goods, food chain, gasoline supplies. You remember the Colonial Pipeline hack? Not so well protected. So look for an up ramp in that. That's something I worry about quite a bit. Last thought, you asked about deep espionage. Over on the Chinese side, less of a tendency to go after traceable, obvious kinds of activities. Look for China to up its game in cyber, but to go after very critical, particularly military and technology targets. That's where their emphasis will be placed. In both cases, 2023 is going to be a year where we see more offensive cyber directed against us. We need to get ready.
Admiral, you're chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation. You work at the Carlyle Group. You're out and about on many boards, et cetera. What is your advice to people about hiring Chinese nationals who spend at least a few days a year, maybe weeks in China, or who have family there? What's your advice about vetting them?
We have to be very careful. On the other hand, Hugh, we don't want to put ourselves in a position of the United States after the Pearl Harbor attack where we round up the Japanese. And those were Japanese Americans, by the way. Now, you're asking about Chinese nationals.
Nationals.
I think there's a distinction to be made there. And just as we are vetting anyone for their connections with any organization, we ought to look for cues. I think some of the cues to observe in this case would be, what sector are you in? Are you in IT, defense, anything having to do with the electronic world? You need to be more careful. You need to look at time spent back on the mainland. You need to look at where have they been educated. You need to look at what are their connections in the United States. And I'll give you a very personal example. My daughter is married to a Chinese American, brilliant young man, born here in the United States, went to Penn, Ivy League school. His parents, a physician and a businessman, were both born in China. I know them intimately and well. These are 100% loyal Americans. We need to be very cautious about how we approach this, because one of the great advantages of this country is the fact that people want to come and live here. And so many of the Chinese who have come to work here are with us. They stand with us. But having said all of that, yeah, we need to be cautious and we need to vet. And we need to look at time on the mainland, family connections, and what sector you're in.
Now, a practical question, Admiral. I've talked with Chairman Gallagher, who will be running the Select Committee on China, as I know you have as well. And the question always comes up, make sure you distinguish Chinese Americans from Chinese nationals, because the former should not be swept into even a cyber camp of any sort. They ought not to be looked on with any suspicion whatsoever. If you're an American citizen, you're an American citizen, and getting there means you've been vetted. But if you're an employer of a multinational, obviously this deep espionage, there are hundreds of thousands of Chinese nationals involved in the CCP's outreach. Does the Bureau, the FBI, does anyone in America open a window and say, tell us who you're worried about, we'll give you an answer?
All of our organs of government, if you will, must recognize that this has got to be a public-private effort. We have got to work together. And I'll give you a practical example of this, Hugh, and you mentioned it already. It's in the cyber world. If you think of our ability to protect ourselves in cyber like an iceberg, the little tip of the iceberg, that's what the government can do. The mass of how we can protect ourselves is in the private sector. So we have got to see our most senior entities, and you mentioned correctly the FBI. I would point to Department of Homeland Security, and in particular the Cyber Security Infrastructure Agency, just stood up, led by Jen Easterly. There are organizations in the government that are tasked to do this. They need to be, and to my eye, they are engaging with the private sector to make sure that information flows across those breakers.
So if you're the head of HR for IBM, or you're the head of HR for CNN, or a media company, which I think is very vulnerable to being penetrated, and you've seen the Americans, and you don't want to be hiring the Chinese spy who's in the United States under deep cover, which is a real thing. That's what I did 40 years ago for DOJ with Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants on Russians and Germans and East Germans and Cubans. Now it's Chinese. Where do you go in the government, Admiral? We got 20 seconds. Where do you go?
I'll give you 3 letters, FBI. If you are really concerned about internal espionage activities in the United States, you go to the Bureau, and they will pipe you.
Admiral James Stavridis, retired U.S. Navy. Follow him online at Stavridis J. Thank you, Admiral. I'll be right back, America. Stay tuned.